For those of you who expected a written speech, which I'm going to read out, that's not the case. I want this to make more conversational, but very personal, at least to me. And I have one headline, and then key messages underneath, and at some point you will judge whether that makes sense or not. But the headline is, we're all African. We are all African. Why? What happens in Africa today or tomorrow has major repercussions in what's happening in the rest of the world. Point in case, here in the Netherlands, for those who travel for the Changemaker School, I'm sure you've seen all the nice parts, but if you look under the carpet, if you zoom into the politics, into the domestic politics, is a politics of populist nationalism, where we are closed in, where borders are closed, where the other side is seen as absent at most, and perhaps even as enemies at worst. So in my reflections on We're All Africans, today I want to present three issues. One of which is the world around us. Secondly is, because it is the title, a part of the title, on adaptation finance. And then the third is, what does it have to do with us here in this room? And on the first bucket, the world around us, although I cannot claim to be from Nairobi, I cannot claim to be from Kenya, I also cannot claim to be from Africa. I'm trying to project the geo-economic and the geopolitical reality around us from the perspective of Africa. And I just want to test, particularly for those who are from Africa, a couple of those assumptions. One, obviously, the world is impacted by the Ukraine crisis. Obviously, the world is impacted by still the recovery of the COVID crisis. And when I had this lecture a year ago, my headline was about high inflation and the high cost of living. And what you see now, if you follow the IMF sort of statistics, that although inflation levels are basically receding, it's the positive side of things, partly because of monetary policy. The other side of thing, on the economic development, it's quite a bleak picture. Last month, some of you perhaps as well, I was at the United Nations General Assembly, right? It's the 1 week where all heads of states come together in New York, and where Kristalina Georgieva, head of the IMF, who sits in the board of GCA, she came out with a statement on behalf of the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and she said, well, if you look at the economic projection for the next 5 years globally, it's an increase in GDP on an annual basis of 3%. And you think, well, that's not bad. If you compare that, though, for the decades before COVID, the global GDP median was 4%. It's a 1% reduction in economic growth. However, if you zoom into Africa, particularly to the low-income countries, 7.5% of GDP growth reduction compared to the pre-COVID era. So inflation is down. There's still this economic reality, particularly in Africa, which is very severe. Next, particularly for Kenya, because I know the Kenya situation relatively well compared to other countries. If you look at debt distress, the numbers are shocking. The increase in sovereign debt on the continent compared to the pre-COVID reality, there's an increase of 185%. Subtext, 4 out of 10 sub-Saharan African countries spend more of their public expenditure on debt servicing than on health and education combined. Subtext 2, most of the newly accrued debt is from private creditors. Why is it important? It limits, of course, the debt restructuring operation. Against that backdrop of reduced economic growth, of increased public debt, with the youthquake underpinning this, it is not a complete surprise that in several countries across the continent there is a civil uprising, mainly driven by the youth constituency. We saw it in Senegal, we see it in Kenya, I saw it in Ivory Coast. So against that background, the question is, what to do? There is this sort of a hollow phrase of globalization. And obviously those who study here and those who have studied before are still studying, we all know, of course, there are winners and losers within the globalization paradigm. I was last week in China at Tsinghua University, one of these top universities in China. And of course, when you go to China, you get your briefing, you get your statistics, you get your IMF reports, you refresh your economic data. If you look at the latest IMF data on China, there's a very interesting graph which says in 4 decades, in 40 years, 1 billion Chinese were lifted out of extreme poverty. In a country of 1.4, 1 billion. This is not to argue for that globalization is the only way to go, and there is sort of, and then there are also the particularities underneath. And on the wave of China, if you talk to Jeffrey Sachs, Columbia University, he would say, well, the next wave after China was indeed India. And when I talk to African leaders, whether it's Macky Sall or Ruto or Tshisekedi, they say, we're next. Our aspiration is, we've seen China rising. We've seen India rising. We're now with over 1 billion people, and in 20 years, 25 years from now, we're 2 billion people, or perhaps even more. We know that by 2050, 1 in 4 people on this planet will be from Africa. This is, an African leader would argue, this is Africa-centric. And when you talk to them, or when you listen to them on TV, or when I talk to them, they say it's Africa-centric, it's up for grabs. If we get the global system around us designed in a way which works for Africa. Reality today, geo-economic fragmentation. What does that mean in a simple term? Is that you see tariffs, industrial policy, subsidies, domestically implemented, is on the rise. Case in point, China, to stick to the example, electric vehicles receive subsidies from government, 100% tariff in the United States, 100% tariff in Europe. Does that help the green transition? Probably not. There's a whole subtext below. But if you look at the statistics, in the last 2 years, since the start of the invasion in Ukraine, Geoeconomic fragmentation is up, pure by numbers of measures being implemented domestically and the retaliation in response. So if globalization, if international cooperation is at least part of the solution, how does that then contrast to the current reality of geoeconomic fragmentation against a context, as I just alluded to in my previous statement, here in the Netherlands, of populism? In the United States, elections coming up with America First, where basically we have a retreat in international cooperation. My proposition is this, and this is particularly relevant for those, for the Changemakers School, who are already in sort of mid-career positions, who bring their own expertise already to the table. That adaptation, which for many policymakers is seen as something very elusive, which they cannot get their arms around what does it mean, adaptation? In my discourse, adaptation is about people, is about a smallholder farmer who has access to drought-tolerant seeds. It is about a city maker who has the tools to have urban planning designed in a way that climate risks are being embedded. It is about a country which has projected an early warning system so that the hurricanes which are coming are basically being caught beforehand and that measures are being taken. This people agenda of adaptation is very forgotten. So we at the Global Center on Adaptation, as you know, we are a relatively new organization. We're 6 years old. And I said it many times to colleagues from the GCA, I said, we started with 2 people and a dog. I was literally the 2 people and the dog. And we had 1 chair, which I was the CEO, I called myself CEO, with nobody else. And I had 1 chair, which was Ban Ki-moon. But in 2018, we made a very explicit decision to frame adaptation not just as a moral issue. I think for the African colleagues here, it's very clear that we're all in the eye of the climate storm, so to say, but Africa is ground zero. Just look at the 9 out of 10 countries most vulnerable to climate change globally are in Africa. Africa itself is emitting less than 3%, but is bearing the brunt of the impact. So in fact, there is a very strong moral case to be made about the climate apartheid regime, which is unfolding in front of our eyes. But my take is, this moral case is not compelling enough for decision makers to change the global system around Africa. My working assumption is that change on adaptation, and particularly on adaptation finance, to which I come back to in the next few minutes, has to be framed in economic terms. So in 2018, and 2019, and 2020, 2021, all the way up to today, our argument, our central argument is a dollar, pound, euro, Kenyan shilling, or whatever currency invested in adaptation has a much higher return on investment. That is why we're focusing not on environment ministers, good people, we're focusing on finance ministers and heads of states who have a core responsibility on the economic restructuring. Because think about the facts. Adaptation finance, we all know, those who study adaptation, those who live adaptation, we know that there is this 2015 Paris Agreement. We don't need to unpack that. We know there were 3 things in a Paris Agreement which are relevant. The 1.5 target, we're off track. The $100 billion, we know it's not enough. That's the discussion this year. And there's an adaptation imperative in the Paris Agreement. Coming out of Paris, I was in Paris, I'm sure some of you were too. It was the 1.5 target was the headline. It was the $100 billion for sure was the headline. But adaptation was absolutely and is still today the poor cousin in the climate debate, and within that, in the overall sort of geo-economic reality around us. Facts. 2021, 6 years after Paris. Every year there is a climate conference. Next month it is in Azerbaijan. Next year is a very important one and I'll come back to it in Brazil. But in 2021 was a super important one. For those who live, study, breathe adaptation, 2021 was the moment of awakening. Because in 2021, the international community agreed, signed on the dots, a promissory note. A promissory note which said that by 2025, i.e. next year, adaptation finance would double. So, that's the international commitment, but what is the reality and what does that mean for Africa? The reality is, today, 10 billion US dollars flows from the global north to Africa, specifically on adaptation. $10 billion. And you might think that's a lot of money, and perhaps it is. What are the adaptation needs articulated by your governments themselves? If you just aggregate it and you look at the national plans, the national determination, the national economic transformation, the national adaptation program, if you just add up the numbers based on a sort of a country needs assessment, the needs assessment is $100 billion a year. So there is 10 billion flowing today, and there is a $100 billion need, i.e. there needs to be a tenfold increase to address the adaptation finance gap. The Netherlands, France, UK, Canada, United States are, as we speak, in active conversations to cut development finance. Development finance is butchered. Last few days in Parliament in France, discussions on the national budget, butchered. And who do you think is sort of the collateral damage within development finance, which already is very limited? Obviously, is adaptation finance. Why? Because it's not considered as the central economic imperative for prosperity and growth in the countries where it is invested. The tragedy is, for those who study development finance, it's extremely important to appreciate that the whole development finance categorization, what does it even mean, development finance, has shifted dramatically since the invasion in Ukraine. Since the invasion in Ukraine, within OECD countries, development finance also is qualified if a country like the Netherlands provides arms support to Ukraine as development finance. So not only the pie is shrinking, but also what qualifies as development finance, the scope has changed. With other words, that has massive implications to the flows to Africa. So in that reality, we all operate. Economic growth, slowing. International cooperation, slowing, tanking. Finance flows, reducing. And adaptation is not only the poor cousin in the climate debate to mitigation, although that's off track itself. As you know, in the last 24 months, there was this massive political mobilization for loss and damage. Right? What is loss and damage? Loss and damage is financing for climate impacts which have already occurred. So Africa, climate vulnerable nations in the last 2 years were on a campaign to get the loss and damage agenda capitalized. Right? A loss and damage fund had been capitalized, and there were this a Pyrrhic victory of $1 billion for loss and damage. Think about it. I mean, just in terms of the scale and the needs, and that was being accepted as victory by not just Africa, but by the global South as a whole. But again, adaptation now being sandwiched, being mitigation, and the loss and damage debate, which also has massive implication on the mobilization for Africa on adaptation. So 10 billion is flowing, $100 billion is needed. And if you zoom in on one particular sector, which I think is very close to those who have traveled from abroad, is obviously agriculture. Right? Agriculture, I mean, it is for me also a very sad story with two tales. Africa, a continent with the most uncultivated land worldwide, right? 65%. We know that the potential for the agriculture sector, for the market growth by 2030 in Africa alone is $1 trillion. Yet, the import bill which Africa pays on food is what? $75 billion a year. What if we transform the agriculture sector not only to feed Africa itself, right? The 287 people will go to bed hungry every single day, right? Not to the low bar, but it becomes a net exporter. And that is precisely where adaptation comes in. It is precisely because of innovation and technological breakthroughs. It's not the only solution, of course, to increase productivity in the agricultural sector. I think we all appreciate that. But there are very important interventions which are up for grabs to basically lift, including on trade liberalization within Africa itself. I think we all know there is this Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, which is massively important to increase the connectivity within the continent, particularly for agriculture growth to take off. So with this as sort of, if you drive from Rotterdam to Leeuwarden, you have not been to Rotterdam today, or perhaps not even the last few days, and you drive here, the skies are very dark. Right? The weather is very dark. Right? So I think the first part of my sort of conversation just now is sort of quite a dark picture. But that's not the only thing what the Netherlands has to offer. Basically 360 days a year, it is like this. But there are 5 other days where there are bright spots. So in the mobilization of adaptation finance, if we share the assumption that adaptation and development finance cannot be disconnected, that there is no development without adaptation, and quite frankly, there's no adaptation without development, there is a shared assignment for this room, and outside this room, obviously, to crack the problem set, where do we get the 90 billion per year? Because even if doubling adaptation finance were to occur magically from the international community, which is not happening, currently globally is 20 billion, from 22 double is 40, we're far off what Africa needs. So that's why I want to present a couple of thoughts, again, to be debated. Because they're all politically charged. Footnote. One of which is fossil fuel subsidies. The numbers. Globally, how much do governments spend on fiscal revenues in inefficient fossil fuel subsidies? Somebody knows the answer? $1.3 trillion a year. And I think when you speak to President Macky Sall when he was president of Senegal, or when you speak to President Ruto, he would say it is extremely difficult to get rid of fossil fuel subsidies because we will have a civil uprising. But if you look at the economics, fossil fuel subsidies are one of the most inefficient sources of revenue because it serves just or 6 times more the top 20 richest folks in a country than the bottom 20%. Right? So if you think fossil fuel subsidies helps for poverty alleviation, it's the wrong instrument. You're spending a lot of money. Two, I don't want to challenge the difficulty of the transformation of fossil fuel subsidies. When I was the climate envoy at the World Bank, I have been arguing this for 25 years, mindful, of course, how politically charged this is, how important it is to have a sort of an underlying communication strategy with society, which basically explains this in a sort of rational way, which speaks to the minds of people on the ground. But the second point is even more compelling, I would think. Carbon pricing. Right? Putting a price on carbon. Right? It's the most obvious way, at least in economic terms, to adjust sort of and transform economies. What do we know? 2015, it's not about me, but I happen to have launched the largest carbon pricing alliance globally at the Paris COP. In Paris, in 2015, if you think about global emissions, 10% of all global emissions were covered in one way or other in a carbon pricing regime, right? The EU is one, but if you look at all the emissions, it's 10%. Where we are today, it's 25%, right? So we would say that's an increase, right? From 10% to 25%. But what is not increasing enough is the price of this carbon pricing, the price of a ton of CO2, right? It's still in the range of €5, dollars, pound to 10, and it has to go to be efficient to 70, 80. What if we were to implement a global carbon pricing regime which steers economies, which generates revenues, which partly then can be offset and channeled into the job and the growth agenda, in this case, for Africa, right? That's sort of a revenue creator, which is not on track. The third piece is for those who works for government here, from the African colleagues. Someone is working for government, yeah, for government. Yeah. So you as well. Okay, good. So if you zoom into the Kenya situation, I think it's an illustration which basically tells in my view, the challenge on the continent. High debt, low growth, sticky inflation. So, and President Ruto, who you know, but I know extremely well, he said, well, I have a challenge here. My debt servicing is this. My fiscal space is this. What to do? What to do? I need to lend, right? I either raise taxes, right? I either raise taxes or I lend from abroad. And first, at the first instance, he said, okay, I'm going to lend from abroad. And that's where the conversation with the IMF started. The IMF came to Kenya, and they basically, what the IMF does, I mean, for those of you who study the IMF sort of, why do we have the IMF in the first place, right? United Nations, peace, security, what's the IMF doing? It's basically about price stability and financial stability. So when they go to a part of their mandate, they go to a country, in this instance, Kenya, because they asked for a loan. What they do, they provide a mirror on the economy, in this instance, of Kenya. And they say, wow, what we see in Kenya is basically, I even wrote up because I read the report again, tax revenues in Kenya and in many other African nations is way too low from an economic efficiency point. It's too low. It doesn't mean that you have to tax the lowest communities, right? You can tax tourists, you can tax aviation, you can tax multinationals, but the tax base itself for any country to have a sustainable fiscal regime, it has to be 15% or higher as a ratio to your GDP. Most African nations are below 5%. So the tax base, the IMF said, way too low. Obviously, when you're sitting president and you have to think about tax increases, it doesn't make you popular. Second point, you, Kenya, but the same applies to Senegal, or the same applies to Ghana, or the same applies to Ivory Coast, or the same applies to Benin, your public expenditure, how you spend money. We don't even need to talk about, I did an interview with BBC Hard Talk. There's always these terrible interviews, right? BBC Hard Talk, 25 minutes, you have no idea what the questions are, and they just try to get you off guard. And then the question, Stephen Sacker said, okay, where are you? Okay, man, Patrick, you talk about Africa very passionately. But are these folks not all corrupt? Can we not talk about corruption? Obviously, I tried to evade that question a little bit, but he came back. The reality is, it's not only corruption what is a challenge in Africa. It is also the decision on where public resources are being spent in, right? There's not an efficient way of spending. So the mirror of the IMF said, well, actually, you need to increase your tax base, but you also, can you be more mindful about how you spend money? And thirdly, the business environment, right? For businesses to start, to continue, to connect to, let's say, other parts of within the country, but outside, the business environment is not at the level for which the country can really thrive. It has to come from the market itself. So in that conversation, in this instance, in Kenya, the IMF said, okay, we're willing to lend, it's not pocket money, right? We lend $1.5 billion, but you need to make some changes. You need to make some changes, because otherwise your macroeconomic stability, that's the core sort of concept of the IMF, is basically in danger. It doesn't work. Well, the Kenyans are here. They know what happened then. It became part of the so-called finance bill, because Kenya said, okay, we're going to take it. We have to take it. We can't pay for health. We can't pay for education, let alone for paying for adaptation, completely non-existent. We're basically breaching, Ruto says, I'm breaching the social contract which I have with my constituency because I cannot deliver on the basic services, so I have to lend. And hence, the lending came with conditionalities, rightly or wrongly, those 3 points, those were embedded in the finance bill, and then the whole country went upside down, quite frankly. And the young people in particular marched to the street, finance bill pulled, and the country, as a Kenya, does not have a finance bill. Can you imagine? You're a country, you're an economy, you don't have an annual budget, right? Obviously, understandable, given the geo-economic forces, given the geopolitical forces, given the challenge you have in a country, but not having a finance bill is not the way to go. But that doesn't mean that it is easy to get out of it. So, what do we do as GCA to basically try to support a country like Kenya or a country like Senegal or a country, all the others? We went, and that's Adele's part of her job, we talked to the IMF. And we said, okay, listen, you lend. The IMF is the lender of last resort, right? They first try to lend on the capital market. Well, first bilaterally, then capital market. That all doesn't work, or the conditions are really off. Interest is X. Need to pay in the next 6 months. A country cannot do that. So then you go to the IMF. So we said, okay, we understand the challenge, but what if in your policy package, when you, IMF, negotiate the policy reform, right? IMF is about policies, the policy reforms. What if we and that's what Adele does, what if we join the negotiations? And we say, okay, that 1.5 billion here and 2 billion there to country X, Y, Z. What if in the policy changes, you also take a climate adaptation lens? For example, every country, of course, has building codes, or you can build there and not in that flood-prone area. But 9 out of 10 African countries have not considered in these policies, these sectoral policies, the climate risk. Why? Because they don't have the data, they don't have sort of the support to do it. So we said, well, what if we, as GCA, from our own budget, support you, country X, Y, Z, to basically, in your policy reform, when you get a tranche of lending for, say, a building code, I'm just making it up, $50 million, that we embed the climate adaptation agenda. So with other words, our main strategy to mobilize resources, in this instance, for the African continent, is to influence existing finance streams, IMF point in case. The second one, who from you has ever worked with the World Bank? Projects, finance, receive something. So, for the students, IMF is about policies. The multilateral development banks is about project finance, right? There are policies that you need to change, and then there is an agriculture project. So the other half of, of your job is the projects side. And of course we have colleagues here as well who do that. So the second part is what we said. I went to Barbados a couple of weeks ago. Why is it? Well, it's nice, but why is it relevant to go to Barbados? Why would I go to Bridgetown? Well, there is something like a Bridgetown agenda. It's extremely important. You cannot study adaptation governance. You cannot graduate with a bachelor, master, let alone a PhD, if you don't understand these global processes around us. One of which is called the Bridgetown agenda. And why Bridgetown? Because Bridgetown is the capital of Barbados. And why is that even an initiative coined Bridgetown? Because it was Mia Mottley who is spearheading it. Mia Mottley, also part of our board, that's a separate point. She said, if you think about the Bretton Woods institutions, right? World Bank and IMF. And if you just look, and we go 80 years back, here in this country, actually in this town, the World War was massively sort of intensifying. Germany invades not only France, but here in the Netherlands, here in Leeuwarden, even sort of, if you just go around, you walk around, you can even see some memorials around it. The world responded, the winners responded, said, well, that never again. We had the First World War, now we had the Second World War, that never again. So obviously the United Nations was established for peace and security. But on the back of that Second World War, in 1944, this is exactly 80 years ago, right? I mean, 80 years ago, 2 months ago, the alliance, who was already expecting to win from Germany, they said, okay, to have peace and security, we also need economic stabilization. And in Bretton Woods, right, that's why it's called Bretton Woods. In Bretton Woods, there was a conference called the Bretton Woods Conference. And that Bretton Woods Conference agreed on the establishment of the World Bank, then at that time had a different name, and the IMF. And I told you, I dealt that before. If you just look at these sort of decision notes from that Bretton Woods Conference, right? I mean, I find these things fascinating. You go 80 years in time. What did they agree on? I mean, on terms of basic principles. You can just look at the speech of the chair of that conference, who of course was American. So the US Treasury, which is the finance minister, at that time was Morgenthau. I also had to look that up. But in the closing statement, he said, the vision for the Bretton Woods institutions, World Bank, IMF, is to create a vibrant economy where all people in all nations live up to their full potential. Vibrant economy, all people in all nations live up to their full potential. Obviously, in 1944, many of the African nations, many of the small island development states didn't exist, right? That was sort of the colonial era still. So the Bridgetown Initiative is meant to correct the fundamental injustice in the international system against the now independent states who do not have adequate shares in decision making. And what Mottley said, Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados, said, listen, think about it. We're Barbados. We do not have access to World Bank financing because of the criteria the World Bank uses. So we're out for that. When a disaster hits Barbados, well, we saw it over the summer, we have all these debts. what if we change the international system that when disaster strikes, debt payment is suspended, right? So there are certain elements in the Bridgetown agenda which are super important for all of us here, for our daily lives, not only just to understand, but to influence. That's what we try to do in terms of the Bridgetown agenda, so that it becomes fit for purpose for today's talk, for Africa, but in essence, for the global South. Now on us. GCA. How do we collaborate with Africa, and how with some of you already on a daily basis, right? So the policy reform I just try to touch upon is the IMF influencing in certain countries where they have active conversations. There is something like a Resilience Sustainability Trust. We join the conversation to make sure that money which goes in is climate proofed. That's sort of the essence of what we try to do. And what we do is provide the analytics to back that up. Secondly, in 2021, April, I had the honor to chair the largest Africa Adaptation Summit ever. So there is a summit, there are over 38 sitting heads of state joining, and we have some newcomers from GCA, but I mean, we were still with a very small team. It was pure politics. So what I, with my sort of incomplete picture of Africa, what I put on the table, I said, well, what if we launch during this summit the Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program, right? AAAP, $25 billion over 5 years. So you have a summit, you present a program, because the argument which the developed world is using, if you talk to a finance minister or development minister in the Netherlands, France, or all these countries, they say, well, actually, we stand ready to invest in adaptation in Africa, no problem. But what we don't see, where are the projects? Where's the pipeline? Where are the programs, right? So they hide behind the facade that there's no projects ready to invest in. So with the AAAP, the Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program, $25 billion over 5 years, we said, okay, well, we hear you, developed world, that you don't see the projects, but here it is, 25 billion. Well, that's what we need. These are the pillars. So what we do, we work, Adele is here and colleagues are here. Have you already talked about it this week or not at all, the AAAP? Yeah. So we have these here, you know them, we have the different pillars, but the bottom line is what we do. We climate-proof development, right? We start with the African Development Bank, from the World Bank, then we do the policies. And the next iteration is, what is the role, for those who are in policies today, what is the role of the private sector? There is no way that the 10 to 100 billion jump, right, the tenfold increase, will be filled, the 90 billion per year, by sort of bilateral funding, let alone grant funding, alone, right? That's never going to happen. Reality is, fact, if you look at adaptation finance, look at another region, go to Asia, large portion of the adaptation share in finance is in the private sector. Go to Africa, 3%, right? So why is it working in Asia? Why is it not working in Africa? So one measure which we're currently pioneering is to work, that's just one measure, because obviously that's not the whole answer to that problem set, is to work through financial intermediary. It's a very fancy word, to commercial banks, right? So I'm a commercial bank, I'm the equity bank in Kenya. I'll loan out to a farmer. Would it not be great, would it not be rational that the bank, but also the smallholder farmer, would only loan for particular agricultural practices which are climate smart? But if you're the equity bank, if you don't have the expertise, what is the topology, what is adaptation, how does it even work, what is my portfolio, how to do it? That's what we're doing now. We're pioneering now with a set of banks, including in Senegal, by the way, to basically to articulate how these streams of finance, particularly from the private sector, in this case financial intermediary, can be influenced. This is a long way to say that what we see in Kenya, what we saw in Senegal, which is not over, particularly not with the elections coming up next month, right? That it is a continent, at least from now, I'm portraying this now from outside, right? From outside looking at Africa, is at a crossroad. Right? It's as a crossroad which requires, it's either it becomes the success story of China and India, with of course the downsides involved in China and India, we all get that. It becomes a success story, that it becomes truly Africa-centric, or the alternative is basically more of what we see today, is basically the tragedy of Africa, right? Of the untapped potential. And normally when I give remarks like this, but I don't want to do it today, also there's not the audience for it, I always try to end with a happy note and say, well, and this is going to happen, and this. But quite frankly, in this sort of informed audience, I think that would be very naive to assume that the crossroad and the trajectory is given, is prescribed. My plea to you here in this room, particularly for those who are joining in the Changemaker School, and also those of the students, is to dig much deeper into the context, the geo-economic context, the geopolitical context, the trade context, the measures which flow from that, to identify the levers of change. And obviously there is no magic bullet here. I think we all agree on that. But this is such a fundamentally important agenda, which is super. The reason why I come across as, oh, he is so driven, he's so, and colleagues in GCA say they won't use those words. It's another story. If we don't fix this, if we don't fix Africa's century, it can only be fixed from within, but related to the rest of the world. We will see massive crisis in our lifetime, right? I'm 55, but I mean, in my lifetime, we will see a massive crisis of migration, of starvation, of insecurity. And to end on a positive story, if you look at the data, if you believe in evidence, if you look at the analytics and you see the growth potential when adaptation is embedded in development, in the jobs which are being created, right? I said at the beginning, every month, 1 million sub-Saharans go to the labor market, 1 in 4 lands a formal job. But if it doesn't have to be that way. So my call upon you is, do you know that story, that film, that movie, Milk? Have you seen it? I'm getting too old, I guess. There's a movie, Milk. Gay rights movement, San Francisco, right? What was this? Who was the main actor again? Anyway, Sean Penn. The thing is, think about it. This is more an anecdote. A couple of years ago, I'm for an annual meeting of the World Bank. One year it is in Washington, following year somewhere else. I'm in Lima, Peru. Going to my hotel, it's night, I go to the bar. Who sits there? No idea who that guy is. I order my drink, and the guy next to me happens to be Sean Penn. He came to the World Bank annual meetings. I say, were you not in that movie? Were you not in Milk? He said, yes. He said, it feels very, I'm not gay, he said. But it felt very personal to me, because the headline of that movie, it's about movement building, is I'm here to recruit you. So that's de facto also my mantra for today's conversation. I'm here to recruit you in that adaptation journey, because only together we can make this happen. Thank you very much indeed.